Hello and welcome to the St. Mark's Live. I am Pastor Adam Thomas, and it is Wednesday, June 17th, 2020. And today, I think we're going to have a relatively short stream today. We are having an anti-racist social studies class. I got this idea after watching a video on Facebook about maps, and it made me think of something that I'm going to show you in a couple of minutes. But basically, the reason to talk about this is to start to think about how people in the United States are socialized, meaning how they're brought up within our society, what they are taught, what perspectives they are taught, and so forth, and how those perspectives can contribute to systemic injustice, racism, and white supremacy over the course of decades and centuries. So that's what we're just gonna examine a couple of examples today of things that we were taught in social studies classes, and how we can re-examine those things in light of the desire to be anti-racist. We're going to start with maps. And I want to start with maps because I want to show you a little 4-minute clip of a scene from The West Wing. I'm just going to set this up, and then we'll watch it, and then I'll talk about it a little bit more. All right, so the scene from The West Wing comes from a wonderful episode. It's one of their Big Block of Cheese days, which is where groups come from all over the country who don't normally get to talk to the White House, and and usually these are comedic episodes, but as so often the case on The West Wing, comedy and drama and learning all get put together. So C.J. Cregg, the press secretary, is about to listen to a presentation from a group called the Organization of Cartographers for Social Equality. So hopefully this will all work if I can get it going here. There we go. And let's see here. So here's the clip.
Hi, I'm sorry.
Oh,
Sorry to be late.
not a problem.
I'm C.J. Cregg.
Of course you are. I'm Dr. John Fallow. This is Dr. Cynthia Sales and Professor Donald Huke.
Hugh.
Huke.
Okay, and you are the Organization of Cartographers for Social Equality.
Well, we're from the OCSE. We have many members.
How many?
4,300 dues-paying members.
What are the dues?
$20 a year for the newsletter.
Let's start.
Wait, I want to see this.
This is Josh Lyman.
Indeed you are.
Josh, this is Dr. Fallow, and
Hi.
who's Mary Men.
Yes.
Should we begin?
Yes. Plain and simple, we'd like President Bartlett to aggressively support legislation that would make it mandatory for every public school in America to teach geography using the Peters projection map instead of the traditional Mercator.
Give me $200 and it's done. Really?
No. Why are we changing maps?
Because, CJ, the Mercator projection has fostered European imperialist attitudes for centuries and created an ethnic bias against the Third World.
Really?
The German cartographer, Mercator, originally designed this map in 1569 as a navigational tool for European sailors.
The map enlarges areas at the poles to create straight lines of constant bearing or geographic direction.
So it makes it easier to cross an ocean.
But
Yes.
it distorts the relative size of nations and continents.
Are you saying the map is wrong?
Oh dear, yes. Look at Greenland.
Okay.
Now look at Africa.
Okay.
The two land masses appear to be roughly the same size.
Yes.
Would it blow your mind if I told you that Africa is in reality 14 times larger?
Yes?
Here we have Europe drawn considerably larger than South America. When it's 6.9 million square miles, South America is almost double the size of Europe's 3.8 million.
Alaska appears 3 times as large as Mexico, when Mexico is larger by 0.1 million square miles.
Germany appears in the middle of the map when it's in the northernmost quarter of the Earth.
Wait. Relative size is one thing, but you're telling me that Germany isn't where we think it is?
Nothing's where you think it is.
Where is it?
I'm glad you asked. The Peters projection.
It has fidelity of axis.
Fidelity of position.
East-west lines are parallel and intersect north-south axes at right angles.
What the hell is that?
It's where you've been living this whole time. Should we continue?
Uh-huh.
All right, that's enough of the quote. There is another little section of the video, but basically the next part talks about how we equate size with importance, how we equate northern top to the north and bottom to the south, and how we equate importance to things that are on the top versus the bottom. And at one point at the end of the clip, they actually flip the map over completely and put the southern hemisphere on the top and the northern hemisphere on the bottom. And CJ is just like, oh my God, you can't do that. And they say, why not? And it makes sense because this planet is a sphere, and from space you could look at it from any angle. And yet we have the maps, our quote-unquote traditional maps, socialize us into one manner of thinking. All right, so let's alrighty, let's look at these maps for just a second here. Alrighty, there we go. Okay, so this is the Mercator projection that, or a version of it, that was just shown in the clip from the West Wing. And you can see as they were talking about it in the video, Greenland looking like it's about the same size as the continent of Africa. But if you look closely at the lines of, oh no, of course now I'm going to mix up latitude and longitude. Longitude are the lines of latitude, the horizontal ones. As you get further from the middle, they get wider. And that has to do with trying to flatten out the globe for navigation. Mercator never thought that his map was going to be used to teach geography. It's specifically designed for ships to get their bearings as they're going across oceans. And yet it became the map that was used in Western schools, and definitely was the one that we had hanging up in all of my social studies classrooms in the 80s and 90s. And it wasn't until I saw this episode of The West Wing that I even thought about the fact that there might be other ways to show the map of the world. But again, as they said in the video, we have Greenland and the continent of Africa looking about the same size. We have Europe looking about the same size as South America. We have Alaska looking much larger than Mexico, even though they're about the same size. And Canada, incredibly distorted as you get further north, as well as Russia. And when you think about the equator is meaning the equal part where half of it is above it and half of it is below it. If you look at this map, the equator is actually in the bottom third. It's right there. Whereas if you put it in the map in the middle, it would go through the United States somewhere, which it obviously doesn't. And so when we think about the way that we're socialized by map, specifically the Greenland and continent of Africa issue is the one that is the most pressing for when we think about anti-racism and trying to challenge the structures of racism that have abounded for so long. One of them being the penchant of people to lump Africa in with lists of countries. I'm sure you've heard a politician do that. I'm sure you might have done it yourself. I'm sure I've done it myself, where I've been listing things and listed Africa along with Germany and France and China and Africa, which is incorrect because Africa has lots and lots of countries in it, many of which are very large, as well, all sizes really. And the actual continent of Africa is massive. It just doesn't look like it on the Mercator projection. So let's jump over to the Peters projection, and now you can see that even though the Peters one distorts shapes of things in order to get the sizes right, and now you can see Greenland way up in the top of the map, sure doesn't look as big as the continent of Africa now. So back again, look at the difference. Again, the Mercator projection is based on trying to sail across an ocean and not miss where you're going. And the Peters projection is trying to show how big land masses actually are. And you can see here, when you look at it, you think, wow, that's not what the world looks like. And if that's the thought you have, it's because you grew up socialized by the Mercator projection. Again, the Mercator projection wasn't trying to set up the system of white supremacy, but it has part of this. It's part of the whole process of socialization of a white supremacist mindset. When you think of Europe being in the very dead center of the map and being much larger than it actually is, when it's actually up in the top corner of the map, when you think about north being up. And yet we can see here how much larger Africa really is. And I've actually seen other maps where somebody has taken China and the United States and a bunch of other countries and Europe and smushed them into the shape of Africa to show just how big Africa actually is. And so if you grew up with this map, I'm sure that somewhere in your mind you have this skewed understanding of the sizes of the continents in the southern hemisphere, South America and Africa specifically, and also skewed ideas of how big Canada and Greenland are. The Peters projection is much more accurate and also shows where the equator actually is, which is in the middle. So if you're a parent of a school-age child, you should go to your child's classroom and see if it's this map that they have versus the Mercator. And if they have the Mercator, make a big stink so that this one gets, so the Peters projection gets put in instead, so that our children are not socialized the same way we were with this distorted view of the sizes of the places in the world. All right, so I would like to think that the Mercator projection is a thing of the past. It was made almost 500 years ago, and the Peters one is much newer. Obviously, it's recent, but the Mercator one still to this day, even though it has this crazy amount of distortion, and distortion that benefits the sort of this Western European white supremacist model, that map is still being used now in various ways. The biggest one being, watch this. This is Google Maps. This is Mystic. This is where I am. Let me just zoom out a little bit. Yeah, there's Connecticut. There we go. We're just going to keep zooming. We're going to keep zooming. We're going to, wait. We're going to keep zooming. Oh my goodness. Look at how big Greenland is. Are you kidding me? Google Maps uses the Mercator projection? Why does Google Maps use the Mercator projection? Look at how big Greenland is compared to the continent of Africa. We are still living in a world where the Mercator projection it has precedence and dominance over other more accurate showings of the world map. And we can see it right here in the way Google Maps is done, even though nobody is using Google Maps to sail from Connecticut to Spain. Well, maybe Greta Thunberg is, but nobody else is. All right, so there we go. So when we're thinking about this idea of social studies and how we were brought up to think in certain ways, we can start to train our minds to think in other ways when we expose ourselves to these other pieces of information, like the Peters projection. Okay, I'm just gonna do one more big example here, and it is actually very timely. Because today is June 17th. 2 days from now is June 19th, which is a holiday in most of the country, including in this state here in Connecticut. It is a state holiday. It was created, promulgated as a holiday in Connecticut in 2003, that holiday being Juneteenth. And I want to talk about Juneteenth and how it relates to Independence Day, July 4th, which is just a couple of weeks later. And yet, July 4th is a national holiday, and Juneteenth is not, at least not yet. Hopefully it will be in the near future. July 4th, also known as Independence Day, celebrating the Declaration of Independence in 1776. And yet, when we think about this as Independence Day, we, again, socialized in a certain way in school, at least I was. I would never have thought of Independence Day as being conditional when I was a school-age child. Independence Day, the 4th of July, was the date that we talk about the freedom of our country. And yet, the date of Independence Day, July 4th, 1776, was the freedom of a certain subset of our country. And we are not socialized to think about Independence Day as being independence for white people, for non-enslaved persons. And yet that's what it was, and was for a good chunk of American history. So we have that as our major federal holiday, and we do not have Juneteenth. So what is Juneteenth? Juneteenth is an American holiday celebrated on June 19th, and it is celebrating the date in which, in 1865, in which Union General Gordon Granger read, this is from Wikipedia, read federal orders in Galveston, Texas, that all previously enslaved people in Texas were free. And now you might think, wait a second, wasn't the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, 2.5 years before this? Yes, it was, but because of the way the war was going, and it wasn't assured that Abraham Lincoln had the Confederacy wasn't saying, oh, we must bow to what Abraham Lincoln is saying in the Emancipation Proclamation. It wasn't for 2.5 years before this was issued in the state of Texas. So in Galveston on June 19th, 1865, this proclamation was read, or this order from the Union General, and it said that all enslaved people in the state of Texas were now free. That has become a holiday, mostly among Black Americans, but when is this holiday going to be celebrated as a federal holiday? It should be on par with July 4th, with Independence Day, because it is an Independence Day and a very, very important date that has been celebrated really since the 1860s. And really it wasn't until the 2000s where most states started putting it into their state holiday rotation. But it should be a federal holiday as well. So we can see how we're socialized with the 4th of July as being this major holiday about freedom in our country, even though it was conditional freedom for only a subset of our country. And yet we are not socialized, at least I was, and again, I'm talking about myself here, I wasn't socialized to know anything about Juneteenth until I started looking into it myself in fairly recent years, in my mid-30s. So we have our maps that are skewed. We have our federal holidays that are unbalanced. And there are so many other ways that our social studies class has told a certain narrative that excludes the history of large sections of our country. Like I said, this is going to be a fairly short stream because really what I'm trying to do here is get you thinking about ways that you had been socialized in social studies class, and how it's not, those classes didn't really tell the whole story of American history. They only told a very narrow part of it, or a narrow viewpoint. I'm going to hold it. I mentioned this book last week on my Books About Anti-Racism stream, but I'm just going to hold it up again. This is the book called These Truths by author Jill Lepore. It's very, very long. It is a 1-volume history of the United States, and it does a pretty good job of telling facets of American history that are not present in other history books. I just want to read a paragraph from this book This is from page 45. We're talking about the colonies here. And this is about local history right here in Mystic, Connecticut. Okay. Wealth was a sign of God's favor. Its accretion for its own sake a great sin. New Englanders expected to thrive by farming and by trade. In America, religion and profit jumped together, wrote Edward Winslow of Plymouth. They governed themselves through town meetings. Their lives centered on their churches or meeting houses. They built more than 40 of them in their first 2 decades. In England, they raised money by promising to propagate the gospel, that is, to convert the Indians to Christianity. Massachusetts adopted as a colony seal a drawing of a nearly naked Indian mouthing the words, "Come over and help us," a reference to the biblical Macedonians awaiting Christ. You can find that in the books of the Acts of the Apostles. So here we go. In 1636, New England Puritans founded a school in Cambridge for educating English and Indian youth, Harvard College. The next year, in Connecticut, right here where I'm sitting, in Connecticut, war broke out between the colonists and the Pequot Indians. At the end of the war, the colonists decided to turn captured Indians into slaves and to sell them to the English in the Caribbean. In 1638, the first African slaves in New England arrived in Salem on board a ship called the Desire that had carried captured Pequots to the West Indies, where they'd been traded, as Winthrop noted in his diary, for, quote, "some cotton and tobacco and Negroes," unquote. There would never be very many Africans in New England, but New Englanders would have slave plantations on the distant shores. Nearly half of colonial New England's wealth would come from sugar grown by West Indian slaves. The Pequot War of 1637 happened just around the corner from where I'm sitting. 1637. Keep that date in mind for just a moment, because this is how I want to end right here. I'm going to show you a sign from Mystic, Connecticut, my hometown. Mystic, by the way, is a anglicized rendering of a native word, Missitook, which means kind of a wide-mouthed river. It got anglicized to Mystic, M-Y-S-T-I-C, later on. I'm just going to show you here. This is the sign when you come in. There's 3 of these various roads coming into Mystic. And I just want to finish the stream with this thought. What is this sign telling you about the history of where I'm sitting right now? And how does this sign reinforce the history of white people, the history of white supremacy? It's right down there at the bottom of the sign. Not home to Mystic Seaport, right above that. Settled 1654. Settled 1654. So who were all those people who were here before, who fought in a war 17 years prior? Did they not have this place settled? This sign right here shows how social studies classes in the United States obscure the truth of the history of our country. And they show how that obscuring has led to a white supremacy that encompasses all of American history. So just some food for thought here with this sign, and I'm curious as to how we might address that going forward. I'm curious also what other pieces of your own socialization you can point to as far as what you were taught, how you learned about American history in school, and what pieces of American history were missing from your education. That's it for today. I hope this is enlightening, and I hope it gives you a little bit of food for thought. But between now and Sunday, I hope this is what you're thinking about. And Sunday morning, we are back on the live stream, 9 a.m. for our morning prayer. In the meantime, be well, and God bless you.